And this is the agenda for this week. How is everyone doing today?
Good.
Good.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. We have a vet appointment at 1 o'clock in Eugene, so I'm going to have to stop around 11:45 today. But we have ample time to cover what we need to cover today. All right, it is 10 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started. This is the agenda for today. I just want to show you where we are in the course. So today we are covering chapter 7. And chapter 7 is super important for the rest of this course because next week, in fact, the next two chapters are really, really important, chapter 8 and chapter 9. Chapter 8 is VPN and IPsec. We've talked a lot about IPsec before, and next week we're going to get to know IPsec quite well. And then the following day is adaptive security appliance with all the different services that it provides along with remote accessibility as in VPN. So we'll talk some more about IPsec in chapter 9. And in order for those two chapters to make sense, I do hope that chapter 7 is going to make sense. And if chapter 7 doesn't make sense, then we're going to have challenges with chapter 8 and 9, just to set the ground rules here. And we have ample time. So we don't really have any packet tracer labs for chapter 7. We have a few simple labs that shouldn't take much time. So we have plenty of time to answer all of your questions. And in preparation for today's lecture, I put this together over the weekend. So here it is. So I thought, I will just try and put my thoughts on paper before we go into the slides. And I think if this is going to make sense, then the slides are going to be fairly easy and quick to go over. So let's take our time one more time, and please ask whatever questions you have. And if something doesn't make sense, let's make sure it makes sense before we move forward, because we're going to be needing all of these different definitions. So I want to show you one slide from chapter 8. This is chapter 7, everybody. I just want to show you one slide. So if you remember when we have been talking about SSL, TLS, and IPsec, and I want to show you my favorite table, SSL and TLS, and they reside up here at the application layer, which means the application has to call this protocol. And these are encryption protocols that we use every single day. And HTTP doesn't use SSL, TLS, HTTPS does, as we all know. So we're leaving it up to the application to decide if they want to encrypt or not. IPsec is different. IPsec runs down here at the internet network layer. And everything's going to have to go through this layer, and everything's going to get encrypted, whether the application wants to encrypt it or not, whether the user wants to encrypt it or not, it's going to get encrypted. And IPsec is different from SSL, TLS. These are single protocols. So SSL, TLS, it's a single protocol. IPsec, let me show you. We've been saying, everybody, it is a buffet of protocols. So when we talk about confidentiality, it's like, okay, what would you like to use? When we talk about integrity, when we talk about authentication, when we talk about key exchange, it gives us a buffet of options. And this is really the beauty of IPsec. As new protocols show up, all IPsec has to do is just add these newer protocols, and they're still IPsec with accommodation for the newer security protocols. So let me go back to where I was, and let's ask questions along the way. So cryptography, okay, is a method of protecting information and communication through the use of codes so that only those for whom the information is intended can read and process it. So we're really talking about encryption, and encryption is nothing new. We've been using encryptions for thousands of years. It's said that Caesar was encrypting the communication between him and his generals in the fields. So if the carriers got caught, the messages supposedly were safe. So nothing new here. Of course, now we're talking computers and networking, and it's far more sophisticated, and we use it far more regularly than we used to. A cryptographer, an expert who develops algorithms, ciphers, and security systems to encrypt sensitive information. So these are the scientists that are worrying about, okay, how do we make this information safe and secure? And cryptanalysts are individuals that have the same level of knowledge, except they're looking at it from the other side, an expert in the practice and study of determining the meaning of encrypted information, cracking the code. So cryptographers are the individuals that come up with these codes, and cryptanalysts are the individuals that are trying to break these codes. And for as long as there has been cryptographers, there has been cryptanalysts. Make sense, everybody? So any questions about this cryptography? Because that's what we're talking about when we talk about encryption. All right, so let's talk about these very, very important terms, everybody. I want to go back to the slide for just a minute. You see confidentiality, integrity, authentication. So we have been talking about these all along. In fact, we talked about CIA. I'm sure you remember CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. We talked about AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting. So nothing new, except we're going to be putting all of these together. And in order for something like IPsec to make sense, we have to first understand each component before we can put them all together. And this is my goal for this document. My goal for this document is to explain each of the core security components, the individual Lego pieces. So I want to understand each of these Lego pieces, so when we put them together, they would make sense. And if they don't make sense individually, and then we end up bundling a bunch of them together, they're definitely not going to make sense. And I think you understand this. So let's start with integrity. And we're talking about data integrity. And hashing algorithms are commonly used to verify the integrity of data. So this is when we talk about integrity, we're talking hashing. Okay, that's almost always the case. In other words, to ensure that the data was not intentionally or unintentionally altered. So sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, things happen. Things happen to stored files, and things happen to data that is being transmitted over the network. So sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's unintentional, and we want to know that it arrived, unaltered. One could use hashing to check the integrity of stored files. So it's not only for transmitted data or for transmitted data. And we will look at each of these later on. Okay. So what is the hashing process? We have a message, everybody, and that message can be encrypted or plain text. It doesn't really matter. So we have a message, okay, any length. It could be one character, it can be a book, plus a hashing function. So we have to use one of those several hashing functions, and it gives us a fixed length hash value. It's also called a hash code. It's also called a hash digest. It's also called a hash key. It's the same thing, fixed length. So you take a password, you take a book, you put it through a hashing algorithm, and it gives you a fixed length hash digest. Okay, hashing is a one-way process. So there's no way to go back from a hash digest to the original text, everybody. It's one way. It was designed to be one way. It is one way. There's no way to go back. In theory, impossible to calculate the message from the hash value. Okay, and if someone can do this, then the hashing algorithm is useless. Throw it away. No one's going to use it because it's not supposed to do this. And finally, the size of the hash value is very important. So is it a 32-bit hash value? Is it a 64-bit? Is it a 128-bit? It's very, very important. Longer hash, fewer collisions. And fewer collisions basically where two different strings will produce the same hash value. And we want to avoid this because collisions is what these cryptanalysts need to break the code. Do you guys remember cryptanalysts? So if you are a cryptanalyst, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for collisions. And the more collisions you have, the more different strings can produce the same hash digest, the easier it would be to crack that algorithm. Okay, so the longer the hash digest, the fewer collisions, the more secure the hash algorithm is. Make sense, everybody? So 32 is considered weak, 64 is considered weak. So you want to get into 128, 256, 512 bit hash digest before you say, okay, this is really, really safe. Now, there's a price to pay. The longer the hash digest key is, the more resources it's going to consume to calculate. So it's always a trade-off. And you don't necessarily want to go with 32-bit hash code, nor do you want to go with 512, because they each have pros and cons. And we go back to CBA. What is it you're trying to protect? How valuable is that piece of information? And then what kind of hashing algorithms do we need? Okay. So as far as those algorithms, everybody, this is a list of them. So we have MD5, which means we had MD1, 2, 3, and 4 before. This is a version. And MD6 is already out, and it's 128-bit. And it's considered to be good, but not very good anymore, because computers are getting faster and faster. And then we have SHA, which is Secure Hashing Algorithm, version 1, 160-bit. And then we have version 2 and version 3, and they each come in different flavors. Do you want the 224-bit flavor, or do you want the 512-bit flavor? And I already said longer is safer, is more secure. However, you pay in resources for that longer key. It's going to take longer to calculate, and it's going to slow you down a little bit. And if you have 1 or 2 messages, you want to hash every minute or 2, it's no big deal. If you have tens of thousands, then resource consumption becomes a serious issue. So hashing issue. So this is what we do for integrity. We hash, but there's this one issue that we need to keep in mind, and we'll come back to it later on. What if a bad actor changes the message and the hashing digest, the hash code, the hash key? Everybody? So if they were to change the hash key without changing the message, we would know we have an integrity problem. If they were to change the message without changing the hash digest, we would know we have a problem. But what if they change both? So what if bank A is communicating with bank B, and bank A said deposit $1,000 into Zico's account, and we produced, this is the message, and we produced a hash digest for it. But what if someone along the way, a bad actor along the way, changes the message and then calculates the hash key for the new message, and then they transmit the new hash digest? So that is an issue that we need to be aware of, and we need to resolve as we move forward. Ethernet frame, the Ethernet frame we've been talking about for a long time now. Everybody, this frame right here. And let me show you really quick. Ethernet 2. And here it is. Scroll down. And let me minimize this and move it out of the way. And you see this frame check sequence, everybody? It's 4 octet, which is 4 bytes, which is 32 bits. This is what this is. This is a hash digest. So every time a device is creating a frame to send to the next device, and as you all know by now, frame is hop to hop. It changes from hop to hop. So we have to reproduce the frame many times along the way. Every time we do this, we take the payload of the frame and we calculate a hash value for it. And we put it in the trailer, in the CRC field. And then the receiving computer is going to take the payload of that frame and is going to produce a hash digest for it. And then we compare those 2 keys to one another. And if they're the same, then we say, okay, it wasn't altered. And if they're different, the receiving device will discard it. So remember what I said about the length. And this is 32-bit. So the good news is it doesn't take very long to calculate. The bad news is it's not very secure. and I want to go back to my document, the other document. Okay, very good. So it's 32-bit. However, it requires fewer resources to compute and was deemed good enough for the Ethernet frame integrity by the Ethernet team. So the Ethernet team said, for this purpose, it's not very secure, but it's good enough. Okay, so they, of course, they knew this, but they wanted to be able to calculate that hash super fast. And they said, for this purpose, 32-bit is good enough. Okay. And then for file signature, SHA-256, SHA, everybody, is secure hash algorithm. 256 is a very secure. Remember, 128 is good, but not very, very good. 256 is excellent. 512 is exceptional. So that is used often to create a hash value for a file before encrypting it with the private key, and we'll get to this a little bit later on. Any question on integrity hashing? Really, really important that you understand. So very quickly, everybody, I'm gonna come over here, go to my C drive. Let me go here, Google is good. And let me find an exe file, this guy right here, properties, digital. Do you guys see it? Okay, SHA-256. I hope this makes sense now. So we took that string for this executable file, we put it through the SHA-256 algorithm, and it produced a 256-bit hash digest, hash key. And then we encrypt it with the private key. We'll talk about that later on. And let me pick on a different vendor. Okay. Internet Explorer. Okay. Right here. Properties, digital signature, voila again. And you will see SHA-256 is used often for that purpose. And SHA-256 is a hashing algorithm. Any questions? Move on. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about confidentiality. So we talked about integrity. In fact, I'm going to come back to IPsec for just a second. Okay, integrity, we're talking hashing, and IPsec supports MD5 and supports SHA. And we've talked about each of these. And now we're talking confidentiality. And confidentiality is the same thing as encrypting. We want to make sure only the receiving party can see the content of that message. To ensure only authorized people and or devices can see the message content. Confidentiality is accomplished through encryption. So we have to encrypt, scramble. This is what encryption is. So people along the way can see the zeros and the ones, but they're not going to be able to make sense of the message. There are two different encryption technologies, symmetric and asymmetric. So it gets a little complicated here, but you really have to understand both, and you have to understand them well. So let's go over each of these. Symmetric encryption. Use the same key to encrypt and decrypt the message. Okay, so if you want to encrypt a Microsoft Word document, and we can do this, you're going to use a symmetric key. And the same key you use to encrypt, you will use to decrypt. So this is what symmetric means. Okay, we're using the same key to encrypt and decrypt. And if I was to go here for a second, download, and I'm going to create a new file, a new Microsoft Word file, and call it test. And hello Word, and save it. If I wanted to, I could encrypt it. If I wanted to, okay. Info, protect document, encrypt. Okay, and I'm gonna say CS285, and it's gonna ask for the password again, CS285. We're familiar with this. Okay, how about CS285? Okay, and close, save, and let's go back and try to open it, everybody. And it's asking me for a password, and if I was to say CIS285, it's gonna say sorry, no can do. So we're encrypting and decrypting with the same password. Okay, 128-bit key is considered very safe. So for a symmetric key, the length of that key you're using to encrypt and decrypt, 128 is in 2020 is considered very good. Of course, 256 is considered much, much better, but 128 is very good. A shorter key, 128-bit is a shorter key. It's more efficient. So when we talk about keys, we really have to consider efficiency and resources. So you can use a longer key, and yes, it is more secure, but it's going to consume more resources. And we always have to consider what is it we're trying to protect and what is good enough. What is good enough? So 128-bit symmetric key is very, very good. And we have a bunch of different algorithms, starting from the oldest, okay, it's DES, Digital Encryption System, 56-bit. Remember, everybody, 128 is good, so this is terrible. 3DES, where basically we encrypted 3 times. So we took this old protocol and we use it 3 times, and it can be 112 or 168. Advanced encryption, okay, remember this one, everybody, because you will see it again and again. AES, Advanced Encryption System, and 128 to 256. And remember what we said, 128 is very good, 192 is much better, 256 is fabulous. And then we have Ssl, and we have a bunch of different RC algorithms for encryption. Okay, and what you see a lot these days is this AES, Advanced Encryption System, and occasionally you will see one of the other ones as well. Just remember, 56-bit, okay, is not secure anymore. It would take your PC minutes to crack that code. So it's no longer considered, it was, but computers keep getting faster and faster, and it's no longer the case. So symmetric encryption issues. So I want to capture the issues as we go along so we know the pros and the cons. For network communication, let's say, you connect to Amazon.com, you connect to Gmail.com, everybody, okay? Between 2 devices, how to securely transfer the symmetric key. So we love symmetric keys, and we use symmetric keys all the time. The challenge is if you're sitting in a coffee shop and you want to log on to your bank account, how are you going to exchange that symmetric key? So your PC, your browser to be more specifically, and the bank HTTPS service, can use that symmetric key to encrypt the data that is going back and forth. And this is the advantage of a public key infrastructure, is it gives us a mean of doing this, and we'll be talking about this next. So we love symmetric, except for synchronous communication, real time. You're logging on to your bank account, you're logging on to a Amazon.com to buy something. How are we going to exchange that symmetric key between these 2 devices? So the other flavor is asymmetric. Asymmetric is requires public key infrastructure. If you're making notes and if you don't know what that is, make a note. You need to learn more about PKI, public key infrastructure. Requires digital certificates. You need to learn more about digital certificates. And a digital certificate consists of a private key and a public key. And just like the name says, private is you keep to yourself. This is your private key. You don't share it with anybody. And the public key, just like it says, you share it with the universe. Okay, so you don't have to worry about who has a copy of the public key. It's the public key. You give it to whoever wants a copy of it. And when the digital certificate is created, so let's say you request a digital certificate and they create one for you and they build this private and public keys. So when they are created, the private and the public keys are generated in such a way that what is encrypted by one key, private or public, can only be decrypted by the other key. So this is the magic of digital certificates. This is the magic of PKI. What you encrypt with one, you can only decrypt with the other one. You cannot encrypt and decrypt with private. You can't encrypt and decrypt with public. You can encrypt with private, and then you can only decrypt with public. And you can also encrypt with public, and you can only decrypt with private. Everyone, so we have that unique relationship, very unique relationship between private and public key. Okay. This unique relationship between private and public key results in long keys. So this mathematical formula to enable whatever you encrypt with one key to decrypt with the other key results in very long keys. Okay. So for example, RSA is an algorithm that we use with public key infrastructure and has keys, and those keys can be 1024, 2048, 3072, or 4096. And 1024 is considered poor security. Nobody really uses 1024 anymore because it's poor security, even though the key is very, very long if you compare it to symmetric. Remember, symmetric 128 is very, very good. And here we're saying 1024 is poor. So the shortest RSA key you want to use these days is 2048. And of course, 3072 is better, and 4096 is better than that. So the problem with those long keys is that they consume resources. They consume resources, and you don't want to use them all the time. So if you have two routers, everybody, you have two routers, router A and router B, and each of them have a digital certificate. You're with me? You don't really want to use those private and public key to encrypt and decrypt all the communication between them, even though they can. In theory, they can. They have everything they need to communicate securely with one another. So router A, when sending the information to router B, will encrypt with router key public key, and then router B will decrypt with its private key. And then when router B has something to send to router A, it will encrypt with router A public key, and then router A, with the only copy of the private key, can decrypt with the private key. And this will work perfectly, except the keys are so long and they will consume too much of the router resources. And what we often do, almost always do, almost always, not always, almost always do, is we agree on a symmetric key, router A and router B. They will use their private and public key, and then they will agree on a symmetric key. They will safely exchange the symmetric key, and then they will use the symmetric key for encryption from that point on. Why do they do this, even though they both have a private and a public key? They do this because a symmetric key is far more efficient. It's 128-bit, and it's very, very secure, versus 2048-bit. And 2048 is a much larger key and will consume far more resources. Does that make sense?
I believe so.
You have questions? Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just saying that does make sense.
Am I saying anything new today, or is this mostly a review?
It's somewhat of a review. We covered some of that at classes at OSU for one of our security classes.
Okay, good, good, good. Very good. So please ask. Remember, we need this for the rest of this course. This is a security course. We need this information. You need it, period. Okay. So the private and the public key can be used for encryption. Okay, you can encrypt with private, you can encrypt with public. I already told you this. We can use it for message authentication. Message authentication is really important, everybody. I want to know, where did this come from? So I have a message and I want to be able to authenticate. This came from Frank, this came from Joey, this came from device A, it came from device B. Digital signature. So remember when we talked about file signature, I'm going to take you back, everybody, to file signature. Stay with me for a minute. So I'm going to go back here, Google this file right here, right click on it. Okay. And we were looking at digital. And I said, you know, we hashed using SHA-256 algorithm. Very good. This is step number 1. Step number 2 is we want to encrypt this hash with Google private key, not public key, private key, to let everybody know that this really did come from Google. It didn't come from anyone else. And the file has integrity. So when my computer, when I double click on this file, everybody, when you double click on this file, you don't know it. But what the operating system is doing, it is basically creating a hash using SHA-256 for this file. And then it's decrypting the hash that is attached to this file, and then comparing those two values to one another. And this digital signature is telling my computer two things. Number one, the file has integrity because both of those files produce the same hash digest. And two, I know where that file came from because it was signed by Google, a private key. And just to show you that, click on details and go to view certificate. And this is the certificate. This is the digital certificate for Google. And of course, we can see a lot of details. Here we go. SHA-256, the first part of it is the hashing algorithm. RSA, okay, is the digital signature part. And you can see how they've put those two together, SHA-256, RSA. And this is what I was saying earlier today, is, you know, we're going to be putting all of these different security services together. And if you don't understand each Lego piece, when we start putting those Lego pieces together, they will make less sense. Okay. And then further down, you can see they're using a public key RSA, public key 2048, because this is the smallest good key. 1024 is not good enough. And then it's a multiplication of 1024. And this is the public key. Now this is the public key right here. This is the public key in hex, everybody. Okay. So they're not hiding the public keys. They're saying this is the public key and you will need it to decrypt the encrypted hash digest. So remember, step number one is create a hash digest for this file for integrity purpose. And step number two is I'm going to encrypt it with my private key. And now you have a copy of my public key. You can go ahead and decrypt it. And then you can compare those two digest values and ensure that the file A has integrity and B must have come from Google and nobody else. Okay. If you have questions, I'm going to keep saying, just ask. Okay. So we're using it for encryption. We're using it for digital signature. Okay. We're using it for non-repudiation, which means it couldn't have come from anyone else because, and these are two different things, everybody. I bundled them together, but they are two different things. So digital signature and non-repudiations, it basically means it didn't come from anyone else. Okay. And we can also use it to safely exchange the symmetric key. So remember, when you go to Google, when you go to Amazon, when you go wherever you go, we're not using the private and the public key for encryption. We're only using it to securely exchange a symmetric key, because a symmetric key is far more efficient than using a long private public key. And most of us, you and I, we don't really have a digital certificate. But eventually we will. And even when we do eventually get a digital certificate, we don't really want to use it very much because those keys are just ridiculously long and consume a lot of resources. Okay. So as far as algorithms, we have RSA, which we saw, everybody. And it's very, very popular, just like it says here. This is super popular. This is almost what everybody uses, and it's used for encryption, for message authentication, and for digital signature. And then we have this DSA, which stands for digital signature something, and it's only used for digital signatures. We can't use it for other services like encryption and message authentication. So RSA is by far the most popular. and you will see it over and over again. In fact, just to show you very quickly how popular it is. Okay, I'm done with this. So here we are on Wikipedia, everybody, and this is HTTPS, like everything is these days. And if I was to come over here, more tools, developer tools. So I'm using TLS, remember everybody? Okay, SSL or TLS. SSL has been deprecated by IETL, I think. So it's been deprecated. It's no longer being used. You're going to see less and less SSL, more and more TLS. And like everything else, they have version. And I think TLS version 1.3 is the latest version. So we're using 1.3. Do you remember AES, everybody? Advanced Encryption System 256. This is for elliptical key X25519. And this is the certificate. And then to come and take a look at this certificate, we've seen this before. And here it's telling you this is using RSA. And this is using an elliptical key. Okay. And we'll talk about elliptical keys later on. These are newer keys that are shorter than the RSA keys. So we're using the RSA algorithm with newer key. Cool, everybody? So we're using the old algorithm with a newer key, and those newer keys are shorter and provide very good security. And shorter is good because shorter will use fewer system resources. And if I was to go to CCNA Security, and this is Cisco, okay, they're using an older version of TLS, everybody. Okay, you can see RSA. We just talked about RSA. It's using a 256-bit elliptical key and advanced encryption system 128-bit. And this is the certificate. And I'm not going to bore you with too many of these. We've seen this, and come down here, and we're using RSA 2048 key. And we can do this all day, and you will see this repeating itself. You will still see some SSL, even though it's been deprecated. TLS is the new king, and 1.3 is the latest version. And the whole point of TLS, everybody, the whole point of SSL, okay, it's to securely exchange a symmetric key. So the client and the server will use that symmetric key for encryption. So we're not really using the digital certificate for very much. We're using it long enough during the handshake process. We're using it long enough to securely exchange a symmetric key over the public internet. And then those keys are used for encryption. I know I'm taking my time, but this is chapter 7, everybody. SSL, I talked about SSL, has been deprecated by IETF. TLS is the new king, so you will see TLS far more often. We've talked about digital certificate, and I said it's integrity and authentication, right? Everybody, integrity, the file wasn't altered intentionally or unintentionally. And authentication, yep, this did come from Microsoft, it did come from Google. And this is one exception where you will be using the digital certificate a lot. And I want to explain it because secure email is on the rise for obvious reasons. And more people are using it for good reasons. So they want to secure their email exchange. So let's start by talking about synchronous and asynchronous. Synchronous is you log on to your bank because you want to pay your bills. Synchronous is you're logging on to Gmail because you want to read your email, you want to reply to your email, etc. Everybody, synchronous is you log on to Amazon.com. So synchronous is you have a session. And when you have a session, what you want to do during the handshake, because that is a TCP connection, you want to securely exchange a symmetric key. And then we use the symmetric key for the rest of the encryption during that session. And we said 128-bit symmetric key is very, very secure. It's very, very efficient. It doesn't take nearly as much resources to do what it needs to do. So this works great for any synchronous connection where you have a session. Well, email is different because I want to send Frank an email message. Well, this is not synchronous, this is asynchronous. And he may read it an hour later, he may read it 2 days later, he may never read it. So here, we cannot agree on a session key. There is no session. This is an asynchronous communication. There is no session. So this is a scenario where we will be using the private and the public key. So Frank and I want to communicate securely. I have a digital certificate. He has a digital certificate. I have a copy of his public key. He has a copy of my public key. I keep my private key to myself. He keeps his private key to himself. So far, so good. And now we want to use secure email. So when I want to send him a message, if I want to encrypt the content of the message, I use his public key. So I encrypt with his public key because he's the only person that can decrypt with his private key. And we don't want anyone else to be able to decrypt the message and see the content. Make sense, everybody? And if I want to make sure that Frank knows this came from me and nobody else, then I will create a hash. We talked about hashing, and then I will encrypt it with my private key. And then anyone with my public key can decrypt it and say, yep, this did come from Zico. They can't see the content of the message because the content of the message was encrypted with Frank's public key. And I only used my private key for authentication purposes, for non-repudiation purposes, where no one can repute this did come from Zico because it was signed by Zico's private key. So SMIME is one example where we don't really have a choice but to use those long keys. But remember, it's an email every hour or 2 or 3. So it's not an awful lot of communication. But if you have router A talking to router B, and you have a million messages going back and forth every hour, we don't really want to use those crazy long keys to encrypt all of that communication. That will be taxing. But for an occasional email, using the long key isn't bad. Make sense?
Yep.
Anybody else?
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, let's move on. So we've talked about integrity, everybody, and we said we accomplish integrity through hashing. And we said integrity by itself is not enough because a bad actor can change the message and the hash digest, and it will arrive and it has good integrity, except it has been altered along the way. And we've talked about confidentiality, and we said we accomplish this through encryption. We talked about symmetric and asymmetric. I'm not going to repeat myself. And what we want to use for session communication is a symmetric key. So we have to agree on a symmetric key and then use the symmetric key. And then we come down to authentication, which is obvious. Okay. To verify you are who you say you are. Okay. So this is the task of authentication. And we've been talking about directory services a lot, and we said this is objective number 1. And we've covered AAA before, and the first A is for authentication. Authentication can use single factor or multi-factor, password, token, or biometric. And just to explain why we have these different: password, something in your head; tokens, something on your body like a smartphone; and biometric is your body. And I don't think I'm saying anything new here. And modern operating system hash the newly created password before storing it. So we no longer store passwords unencrypted or even encrypted, because a system administrator can decrypt it and see what the password is. So we hash it. And remember, hashing is a one-way process. And then we store the hashed value of that password. This way, the system administrator has no way of finding out the user password. And when the user logs on with the account password, the password is hashed and compared to the stored hashed password, which is what we do all the time with hashing. We rehash it, and then we compare the hash digest. And if they're the same, good; not the same, we have a problem. Okay, so these are really important, everybody. So before I talk about hash message authentication, message authentication code. I created this document over the weekend. I just want to talk about MAC. Okay, before I talk about hash MAC, let me just talk about MAC. And please don't confuse this MAC with the MAC address. This has nothing to do with the MAC address. And MAC stands for Message Authenticated Code. So remember what we said about the hashing issue. In fact, I recaptured it down here. What if a bad actor changes the message and the message digest? So I want to send a message to Joey, everybody. I hash it and I send the message, encrypted or unencrypted, doesn't really matter. I send the message and I send the hash key to Joey. Well, what stops a bad actor from changing the message and changing the message hash digest? And then the receiving party will say, yep, everything is looking good. So we want to add authentication. I want to add authentication to this. Okay, and that way, not only do I know that the message has integrity, but I can also authenticate this did come from Joey or from router 1 or router 2. It's not just individuals, it's devices as well. And hash MAC is where we're using the hash value to give us this additional piece of information, which is the authentication. So HMAC, integrity and authentication. So hashing gives us integrity, okay, but I need to authenticate this really did come from the right person, okay. So first, the two parties, okay, router A, router B, must agree on a pre-shared secret code. And we've seen this before with MD5, and I'm going to show you. I'm going to go back to a lab we did in chapter 2, and I'll show you what we did there. Okay, so they have to agree. And let's say it's the same system administrator. So you're the system administrator for router A and router B and router C and router D, and you come up with a password and you say, okay, this is the pre-shared password. So it doesn't have to be only between router A and router B. It can be C, D, E, F. All of the routers are using the same pre-shared secret key. And then you configure it. You know, when you configure the router, you say, this is the pre-shared secret key. And then from that point on, every time router A wants to send a message to router B, okay, they add, okay, at the end of the message, this is the message. At the very end of the message, they add the pre-shared secret key, and then they hash the whole thing, and then they send the message along with the hash digest to router B. And remember, it's pre-shared secret password, pre-shared password. So router B has the password, and then when router B receives the message, they add the password to the end of the message. They create a hash code for the message plus the password, and then they compare the two hash codes together. Okay. Everyone need to understand everything I'm saying here, because we're gonna it's here because we need it next week. It's here because we're going to put it to use next week. Nothing in this document isn't going to be put into practice when we talk about IPsec next week. So if you have questions about these individual components, let's figure it out today before we start using it next week. So does this make sense, everybody? So hashing gives me integrity. The problem is, what if a bad actor changes the message and the hash digest? MAC says, I want to add authentication to this. I still want integrity, but I also want to be able to authenticate. And one form is, you know, HMAC. And we have a pre-shared password that we're adding to the message. And I want to show you. So let me go to 285, week 2, MD5. Okay, does MD5 make sense now, everybody? MD5 is a hashing algorithm. It's the 5th version. MD1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is out. So who wants to tell me what is the difference between each of these? What is one big difference between MD1, MD2, MD3? Come on, you know.
The length of the hash?
The length of the hash key. Everybody? So I don't know what MD1 did, 16-bit, 32-bit, okay, and it gets longer. And I'm not saying that the algorithm itself didn't change, but the end result is we have a longer hash key. So let's open this up, everybody here. We're not doing it. I just want to show you. Okay. So we have, here it is. So we have router 1, 2, 3, everybody. And we want to make sure that they authenticate each other before they exchange routing information. Because like I was saying yesterday in a previous class, routing information is like a map of a bank, of a building, of a museum. And bad actors are very much interested in this map because they can see what it looks like. And they can figure out how to get in and how to get out and all that stuff. So we're saying before you start sharing your routing table with anybody that says, I'm a router, give me a copy of your routing table, let's authenticate them. Let's make sure, this is a legitimate router. And router 1, 2, and 3, they have a pre-shared passwords. They can be different passwords. So it can be one password between R1 and R2 and a different password between R1 and R3. But generally, it's one password because it's the same system administrator. And you don't want to make your life any more complicated than it is. So it's the same pre-shared password for all three. And then in here, everybody, you're saying, okay, before I send you anything, I need to authenticate you. Could you please hash your password and send me the hash digest? And then I will hash the password, and then I will compare those two hash digests to each other. And if they're the same, then you're legit. And I will give you a copy of my routing table. And if they're different, I'm not talking to you. So this is a lab we did way back in chapter 2. And we are using hashing not to check the integrity of the data, everybody. We're not using MD5 for data integrity. We're using it to authenticate. Hash the password and send it to me. We're good, everybody? Okay. And this is what we're doing here. Okay. We're using this hash to authenticate. I have a copy of the password. You have a copy of the password. Except I'm not only interested in authentication, I'm only interested in integrity. So you may as well add it to the end of the message and then hash the whole thing and send it to me. Send me the message and send me the hash. And then I will add my key to the message and I will produce a new hash digest and then compare the two. Okay. In order for a bad actor, and I'm saying here, in order for a bad actor to hack the HMAX, they need to know the pre-shared password. And it's a password. You're not going to share it with anybody. You're going to keep it to yourself. And hopefully the bad actors will not be able to get their hands on that password. So if they're just listening to the zeros and the ones flowing over the networks, they're never going to see the password. And there's no way for them to know what the password is. And this is why we can use it to authenticate. And here I'm saying if router A and router B have digital certificate, okay, we can accomplish by digitally signing. So if router A and router B have digital certificates, we can use the digital certificates for everything. The problem is the key is so long, right, everybody? And we don't want to do that. But in theory, you can. Except routers route. That's the job of a router. And you want it to stay focused on routing, which means you want to minimize everything else the router is doing so it can focus on routing. And we don't want it to be spending 30% of its time encoding and decoding. That will slow its purpose in life. So we want to use a short symmetric key. And what I'm saying in this note is if both of them have a digital certificate, then they can encrypt the shared password with their private key and send it to the other router. And then the other router will decrypt it with the public key and compare it to their own password. That's all I'm saying. Because we, as discovered before, we can use PKI for authentication. Questions? It's a lot. Okay, that's the last piece, everybody. Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange. Okay, and Diffie-Hellman is used by IPsec and TLS, two super popular protocols we use all the time, especially TLS. Every time you log on to a website, most likely you are using TPS since SSL has been deprecated. And IPsec, you know, when you have, and we'll talk more about IPsec next week, but if site A is connected to site B and both of them are connected to site C, we're no longer using leased lines. So leased lines are a thing of the past. They're terribly expensive and they're small pipes, very expensive. So everybody is using the internet to connect these different sites to each other. Why? A, the internet is fast. You can get a terabyte or 5 terabyte connection to the internet. Okay, and you could never afford to pay for that leased lines. That would be like crazy expensive. So the internet is fast. The internet is reliable. The internet is secure, many thanks to IPsec. This is why we're talking about IPsec, everybody. And finally, and very important, the internet is dirt cheap. Okay, when I say dirt cheap, I really mean it. It is so cheap. You can get a terabyte connection to the internet for very little money. Okay, and a leased line between Houston and Dallas, when I was working for HP, which is 1.5 megabit connection, that was $6,000 a month. Okay, and it would cost you far less than that to get, you know, a multi-terabyte connection to the internet. And then all these millions of people that are working from home right now because of COVID-19, well, they still have to connect to the office network, and the vast majority of them are using IPsec. So we use IPsec to connect sites to each other, and we use IPsec to connect people to their site. And we will cover IPsec in detail next week. So we still need a mechanism to exchange that symmetric key. Okay, and this is true here. I'm gonna go, where am I gonna go? I'm going to go to Zillow. Secure, everybody, right? Stay with me. Okay, this is synchronous connection. We talked about asynchronous like email and synchronous. So this is synchronous. I'm using TCP/IP. I created a session. Okay, and there was a handshake that took place in the very first few seconds. They're using TLS 1.2. They're using elliptical code with RSA algorithm. Okay, we're using a 256-bit key with this elliptical algorithm, and we have advanced encryption system 128-bit. Okay, very good. And then we have a certificate. But what I wanted to say is during the handshake, you know, my browser, okay, this particular tab right here for my browser and the Zillow server, you know, agreed on a symmetric key, and they exchanged that symmetric key. And now the question is, how do we exchange that symmetric key? So we can both, you know, encrypt back and forth using that symmetric key. So this is what we're talking about, everybody. And one way of doing it is to use HD. Sorry, DH, Diffie-Hellman. So Diffie-Hellman is one of two ways to do this. The other method is to use RSA. So we can use RSA for that purpose, or we can use Diffie-Hellman for that purpose. And both of them accomplish the same thing. It will enable us to securely exchange a symmetric key over the insecure public internet. Okay. The Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange method allows two parties that have no prior knowledge of one another to jointly establish a shared secret key over an insecure channel, which is what I did with Zillow. Okay, they don't know who I am. Oh, it's coming down, raining hard. So, and then, you know, we were able to agree on a symmetric key, and then we use the symmetric key for the rest of that conversation. Okay. This can be then used to encrypt, okay? And then we use that symmetric key for everything else. We encrypt everything else using that symmetric key. And this is straight from Nut Academy, everybody. The DH algorithm is the basis for most modern automatic key exchange methods. Definitely this is what IPsec, and I'm talking about this because I'm preparing you for IPsec next week, and is one of the most today. Diffie-Hellman isn't an encrypting, it's not an encryption mechanism, it's just a key exchange. So that's all, you know, DH does. Its purpose in life is to securely exchange a symmetric key between two parties over the public internet. Okay, and you will see down here there is many flavors of DH, DH 1 and 2, and then DH 14 and 15, and DH 19, 20 different versions. And as you can imagine, DH 1 is less secure, and DH 24 is most secure. And DH 1 uses a short key, and DH 24 uses a longer key. Okay, so let's remember this for next week. And I just showed you a bunch of examples that are using DH to exchange that symmetric key between you and the server you want to securely communicate with over the public internet. So this is an hour, and I like to think this is a good and excellent use of 1 hour. But I do want to take some questions. I'm finding it hard to believe that it all makes sense. I'm not that good.
Well, for the most part, skimming over the top of it, some of this, like the MD5 stuff, I get the RSA and that information, because we covered some of that in the security class.
Okay, good.
284. Yeah.
Yep, that's great. I'm glad to hear that.
Some of this I just need to go back and read through and just entirely ingest like the entire document.
Okay.
But for the most part, I mean, as far as the high level overview, it does make sense. As far as being able to, I don't want to ask those deep down nitty gritty questions because honestly, they don't really matter.
And I don't really want you to ask those questions because everyone, please remember, we are not cryptographers and we're not crypto analysts. Okay, yeah, and me personally, I'm not really interested in becoming, you know, A or B, nor do I have a PhD in math to become A or B, to become a cryptographer or a crypto analyst. When I look at these different algorithms, I just want to know what purpose do they provide? What is MD5? What goes in, what comes out, and what are the issues and how secure it is. I'm not too interested in the inner working of MD5 or SHA 256 or any of these algorithms, and they're gonna go over my head. I'm gonna start reading and I will get to the end of the first page and it's like, okay, I'm done for today. And I'm not interested. And you may be interested, and there's a ton of material out on the internet that, you know, will explain everything in great detail because it's all out there. But in order for it to make sense to me, I don't have the math background, nor do I have the interest. But I'm very, very interested in knowing what purpose does it serve? What is hashing used for? What is symmetric encryption used for? What asymmetric encryption? What authentication? What goes in? What comes out? How good is it? Okay, what do the experts say? I'm not gonna form my own opinion whether, you know, this is better than that. You know, what are the experts? There's lots of experts out there and they're far more informed and experienced than I am, and I'm just gonna take their word for it. Sorry to bore you, but what is super important that you know, what is it used for? How good is it? What goes in? What goes out? What are the issues?
And I think that's also the caveat is just going over the high level thing. I think the other part of it is when you get to wherever you're working, they're going to tell you what to implement unless you're doing like a startup, then you're kind of like on your own.
Yep.
But for the most part, then you're going to have to implement it. And I think that's the point where you're going to go back to be like, okay, I remember some of this. And now, you know, you're getting into a little bit more of that deep nitty gritty stuff of why we're using this. And you have the high level overview now. And I think for the most part, it's all there. I think some of it will come as you use it more than just doing the reading.
So remember what I've been saying, thank you, Frank, about IPsec. It is a buffet, it's a framework, okay? The technical term is framework, not a buffet. I like to think of it as a buffet. And these are the different up here, IPsec protocols, and we'll go over this next week. I'm not interested in this, but look down below. Confidentiality, okay? So we talked about digital encryption system. We talked about advanced encryption system. Integrity, we talked about MD5, we talked about the different flavors of SHA. Authentication, PSK is for pre-shared key. Everybody will talk about pre-shared key. So the administrator, you know, will enter that value, or they can exchange that value using Diffie-Hellman. RSA is using public-private key. And then, you know, the different flavors of DH1, and there's way too many of them. And this is not an encryption protocol. These are the encryption protocols right here. This is a protocol that will enable two devices to securely exchange a session key. That's what I like to call it, a session key. You can call it a shared key securely over the internet. And you have choices. Okay, you have choices. And if you don't understand the difference between DES and AES, if you don't understand the difference between PSK and RSA, if you don't understand the difference between DH1 and DH24, then you're not going to be able to do your job. So you have to know enough high-level information about these so you can put them together. And then at the end of the day, you pick one from here, you pick one from here. Everybody, you pick one from here, you pick one from here, and you pick one from here. So you're not picking them all. You don't really want to encrypt with 4 different encryption protocols. You just pick one. Pick, okay, and then, you know, you connect over the public internet using IPsec. So back here, questions? Anyone else? Okay. Integrity. Okay. Symmetric, asymmetric. Okay. And please don't forget about MAC. Okay. Not only do I want to know that the integrity is good, I want to know where it came from. Did this come from router 2? Did this come from router 3? And we've talked plenty about DH. So let's go over some slides. And I'm going to leave this here because I have a feeling we'll come back to it. And we'll do about 40 minutes and stop. And hopefully the weather will get better. It was raining really hard a few minutes ago. Okay, this is a good place to start. So far in this course, everybody, this is chapter 7. We've talked about firewall. First, we talked about hardening devices. Do you guys remember chapter 2, hardening devices? And then we talked about firewalls, and we talked about intrusion prevention. And what else did we talk about, everybody? Remind me, you know, what was chapter 6 about? Okay, so we've talked about all, oh, chapter 6 was, hold on, what was chapter 6 about? Chapter 6. Yes, securing, okay, very good. Okay, how could we forget, everyone? Securing the local area network, and we talked about port security, and we talked about trusted ports and untrusted ports, and we talked about to harden STP. Do you guys remember that? So we covered all of this. And this is all wonderful. This is all wonderful. The one thing we haven't covered so far is encryption. Okay, so if you have a bad actor over here and they are snooping, they are spying, okay, well, they can see the zeros and the ones. And it may be hard to protect against someone seeing the zeros and the ones. And now we just want to make sure that those zeros and ones don't make sense. We want to scramble them so they don't make sense. And this is what chapter 7, 8, and 9 are all about. We've talked plenty about authentication. There's nothing to say here. So the system needs to know you are who you say you are. You put in your ATM card, are you Zico? Are you Frank? Are you the owner of this card? Okay. We talked about integrity, and we said we accomplish integrity through hashing these days. And in the good old days, if King Philip wanted to talk to Queen Mary, they will write a letter, and then they will use their stamp with wax to make sure that this letter doesn't get opened along the way. Good, everybody? And then we talked about encryption, and I said encryption is nothing new. We've been using encryptions literally for thousands of years. It's said that Caesar was using encryption to communicate with his generals in the field. And of course, we didn't have computers back then. And Caesar encryption algorithm, if you want to call it that, was really simple, was to shift the alphabet by a number of letters, everybody. And then they would say, we shifted it by 3 letters. We shifted it by 5 letters. And then you can map it back at the other end. And then in the people in between, what they're looking at is scrambled letters that are nonsense. They don't make any sense. So it's been around for a very long time, and I don't really want to get into history, but recently there was a movie, maybe a year ago, about Queen Mary of Scotland that got her head chopped off because she was trying to take over the royal crown from Queen Elizabeth, I believe, and she was communicating with her people using encryption. And the British, found the letters, and they were able to crack the encryption, and she lost her head in the process. And that's, a few hundred years ago, but not, 2,000 years ago. Nothing new, except now we have computers and we have massive amount of data flowing back and forth, and we want to protect it. Okay. So here they're talking about, from a very high level, from 5,000-foot level point of view, the different ways we can encrypt. We can do transposition, we can do substitution, or we can do a one-time pad. And I'm just gonna fly over this. I will let you read about it. And again, this is all 5,000-foot level, but this is basically, at a high level what we do to encrypt. And I think, we're all familiar with the German Enigma encryption tool that was heavily used during World War II. And it is also said that the Second World War began to change when the British intelligence and the Polish intelligence were able to crack the Enigma code. Cryptoanalysts, remember we have cryptographers and cryptoanalysts. And cryptographers are the people that come up with the encryption algorithms and code, and cryptoanalysts are the ones that crack it. And there's nothing stopping the same person from wearing the same hat or both of those hats, because it's the same skill set. It's like being a white hat hacker and a black hat hacker. It's the same skill set. How are you using those skills? What are you using those skills for? Okay. As far as methods for cracking code, brute force, we're familiar with this. You try every different combination, and it's really funny that they have this lock over here, because I hike a lot in the forest, and one time I found a lock just like this in the forest, like a really good lock, and I brought it home, and while I was watching TV, I cracked it using brute force. Like, okay, let me start with 000, 0001, 2, 3, 4, after a few hundred tries, and it's 4 digits, so this is a maximum of 999 different tries. So they're saying, or you may have multiple copies of the cipher text. This is the encrypted text, and you try to make sense of it, or what the plain text is, or remember the collision I talked about. So you say, this two different strings of plain text produce the same encryption, the same hash code, and this is a gold mine for a cryptoanalyst. Like, okay, now I have a clue. I will start from here. We talked about cryptology, cryptographers, cryptoanalysts. NSA, National Security Agency, this is the premier spy, cyber spy agency in planet Earth, NSA. And they spy on you, me, Russians, Chinese, and everybody else. And they're usually just listening to those zeros and the ones and trying to make sense of them. And they have many crypto analysts that work for them. They have many supercomputers, and they do their job very effectively. All right, now we get to something relevant. Integrity, MD5, remember this is the 5th version, 6 is out. SHA, we have many flavors of it. These are hashing algorithms. At the other end, we have confidentiality. So we have digital encryption, free digital encryptions, advanced encryption system, and others. Okay, and then in the middle, we have authentication, where we're using both. Okay, so not only am I interested in integrity, I want to know where did this message come from, and we've covered this before. Okay, and this is MAC. You see MAC, everybody? You see this MAC over here, MAC, for message authentication code. So here we're using hashing MAC with MD5, or we're using hashing MAC with SHA1. Remember, we have 2 and 3. And then, of course, we have RSA, private public key, for encryption and authentication. And we have digital signature, where we can digitally sign something that says, yep, this really did come from Zico and nobody else. And here's the explaining what hashing is. You take a plain text, any length. It could be a character, it can be a password, it can be a book. You put it through the hash function, which is an algorithm, and you produce a fixed length hash value, hash key. And we said the length of this key is very important. So short is less secure, and long is more secure. And here they're just giving us an example, where, 2 entities want to know this message arrived intact. It wasn't altered along the way, intentionally or unintentionally. But remember, unless we can authenticate, we don't really know if the message and the key were altered along the way. And this is why authentication is very important. So these are the different algorithms, okay? MD5 is still used quite a bit. We saw it earlier today when I looked at that lab from chapter 2. MD6 is out. It has some issues, and it wasn't widely used. And that's because SHA2 and 3, were already out and were better. And people always want the better, right? Especially if it's producing the same key length. And this is what I was saying. I just want to know what the experts say. The experts say this is better than that, and it's like good enough for me. I will use, this is what I will use. Okay. So what they are showing us here are the different keys. Okay, MD5, 128 bits. SHA1 is 160 bits, and SHA256 is 256-bit key. And what is really important to remember here is the longer the key, the fewer collisions you're going to have. And that makes it more reliable. Because if we're using an 8-bit key, and I said this before, not today, before, if you are using an 8-bit key, 2 to the power 8 is 256, which means it doesn't matter what you put in, you're only going to have one of 256 different outcomes. Well, how long it's going to take before you have a collision? It's not going to take long at all, right? You only have 256 different outcomes. So it's not going to take long before you have collisions. And if you're a crypto analyst, it will take you 5 minutes to crack that on a piece of paper. And this is why longer is better. And we looked at the Ethernet 2, and we said they are using a 32-bit hash, and it's still weak, but it is good enough. For the purposes we're using it for, it's good enough. And this is all they are showing us here. HMAC. You guys remember MAC? What does MAC stand for? Message authentication code. Okay, I want to authenticate, not just focus exclusively on integrity. Integrity is important. I also want to authenticate. I want to know this came from router 2. It came from router 3. So HMAC gives us integrity plus authentication. It gives us two things. And we covered it before. We said we have a pre-shared key, everybody. So we take the message and we add the key and then we hash. And then what we transmit from router 1 to router 2, we send the plain message. And this plain text message can be encrypted. It doesn't really matter. That's a separate thing. Encryption is a separate thing. So the hashing function doesn't care if it's encrypted or unencrypted, right? Everybody, you're just putting a string. And it doesn't care if that string is encrypted or not. But let's say it's not encrypted. So we have plain text. And then you add the key. And then what you transmit to the other side is the message and the digest key. And then they do the same thing at the other end and compare the two digest keys. And saying, yep, good integrity. And I know it came from router 2 because it used the proper password. Okay. Key management, everybody, this is really important. We're not going to go over it in detail. So we have the key generation. And if you remember, when we generate the private and the public key, we generate them in such a way that what you can encrypt with one, you can only decrypt with the other. Okay. And that is the genius of PKI. This is the genius of PKI, that whatever you encrypt with one, you can only decrypt with the other. And because of the mathematical complication to do this, those keys are really long. 1024 is poor, 2048 is good, and 3072 is better. And then you have to verify. So I'm gonna come back here for just a second, everybody, okay? And I'm still in Zillow, okay? Valid and trusted. So we have to be able to verify. We have to go to a certificate authority and say, is this thing valid or did they just make it up? So we have to be able to verify, okay? And exchange, remember the public key is public. So I'm gonna send my public key to everybody and please give me your public key so I can use your public key to encrypt when I send something to you. Storage, where we're gonna store this type. Key lifetime, these things don't last forever. And I want to show you view certificate and valid from 2019 to August 2020. And then before 9/8, they have to replace this certificate. It's only good for this 1 year. And you don't renew it, you just get a new one, okay, with a different number, etc. And revocation, in case you lose it or it's been compromised or something bad happened to it, so you want to basically let the universe know, this is no longer good. It's the same, when you lose your credit card, right? Everybody, you have a credit card and it's good and people can verify it, can do all that stuff actually. You can apply this to your credit card, everybody. And if you lose your wallet, then you want to call and they want to put in the system that this card is no longer good. And you want to be able to do the same thing with a digital certificate. Okay. So what are we talking? AES, Advanced Encryption System, very, very popular. Okay, 128-bit is good, 192 is excellent, 256 is exceptional. Okay, and time to crack, everybody. Okay, 149 trillion years. I don't know if they're talking about on your PC or on an NSA, supercomputer. But I don't think I will be around 149 trillion years from now, so it's good enough for me. Okay. And they're basically telling us the importance of a longer key, which you already know. 56 means 2 to the power 56. This is how many different combinations you have. 60 means 2 to the power 60. This is how many different variations you have. And the longer the key, the more variations, the harder it's going to be to crack, the less collisions we're going to have, etc. We talked about symmetric and asymmetric, okay? And we said symmetric is what we do most of the time, except email, secure email would be one exception where we don't have a synchronous connection, we have an asynchronous connection, and I have to use the other party public key to encrypt my private key to sign. So that would be the exception. Usually we have a synchronous connection. You log on to a bank, you log on to Gmail, you log on to Amazon, and you want to buy something, and then you securely exchange a symmetric key, and then you use that symmetric key for encryption. Okay, and we can use that private key for digital signature, like you hash the message and then you encrypt the hashed value. This is normally what we're talking about. And this is basically saying, yep, it came from Zico because it was signed by Zico's private key. And Zico is the only person in planet Earth that has that key. Okay. And here they are saying, oops, everybody, symmetric key 80, okay, asymmetric 1248. Everybody, they're saying an 80-bit symmetric key is the equivalent of 2048 asymmetric key. So you can see the difference here. So let's come to 128. Remember, I've been saying 128 is really, really good. This is equivalent to 3248 asymmetric in terms of strength. Because here we don't have to worry about a private and a public, and here we have to worry about that unique mathematical relationship between private and public. And this is why we don't want to use 3248 key every time I want to encrypt. We just want to securely exchange a symmetric and use it for the rest of the conversation. And even with an 80-bit key, everybody, it's good for 3 years. But again, are we talking a low-end PC or are we talking a supercomputer? And I really don't know what they're talking about here. So let's just go with a regular PC. Because I don't think it's going to take NSA 3 years to crack an 80-bit symmetric key. But everybody, or the Chinese intelligence, or the Russian intelligence, or Microsoft, Google, etc. These guys have crypto analysts, and they have supercomputers, and they can do it much, much, much faster. We just don't want them to be able to do it, super fast. So if it takes them, let's say 5 hours, it's good enough for me because I'm never logged on to my bank account for 5 hours. I'm never logged on to Amazon.com for 5 hours. And I don't know what the answer is. So I can't tell you. NSA doesn't share that knowledge with the rest of us. So we're talking about a short key, a long key. Okay, less secure, more secure. And this is true for keys in general, everybody. Okay, so you can see this short key has 1 tooth, 2 teeth, and this one has 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's just, harder to open a lock with this key versus this key. And they're using this as analogy for digital keys. Confidentiality, we're talking encryption. Okay. Symmetric, asymmetric. Okay. Best known as shared secret key algorithm. Remember, we have to exchange that shared key between the two parties. 80 to 256, and we said 128 is very good. I don't think we want to use 80. A sender and receiver must share. So somehow we have to exchange this securely over a public internet. And this is why we have RSA and DH. Okay. Algorithms are usually quite fast. Why are speed? Because they are short. Okay, shorter is faster, so 80 is much faster than 256, but 256 is still much faster than 4096. Okay, and these are encryption protocols down here. Okay, all of these guys are encryption protocols. Asymmetric, best known as public key algorithm. Okay, 512, you don't really want to use it. It's just it's useless. 1024 is slightly better, not good. So 2048 all the way up to 4096. Okay, a sender and receiver don't have to share because they can use the other side public key to encrypt. They can use their private key to sign. Algorithms are relatively slow, okay, because the keys are so long. and it just takes longer to compute with a longer key than it does with a shorter key. And RSA and DH are the two popular ones. Okay, in elliptical curve, those are the keys themselves, and these are the algorithms. So just to make sure you don't confuse all of this, algorithm, key. Okay, so these are the two algorithms that we've seen so far. We've seen RSA and we've seen DH. I don't want to fly through this, so I'm going to stop and ask. You have questions? You're good? Okay, keep going. So we've talked about symmetric and asymmetric. Symmetric is the same key, pre-shared. We use to encrypt, we use to decrypt. Okay, and then for public key, you know, you encrypt with the other side public, you sign with your private key. But oftentimes when we have a synchronous communication, we're using this purely to exchange, securely exchange a pre-shared key, a session key, and then we move on. We talked about these protocols, everybody. Okay, so AES is what I need you to keep your eyes on, everybody. AES. Okay, but there's many of them. This is really, really old. They tried to revise it by adding the 3, which means we're going to run through it 3 times, but it's not popular anymore. AES is very popular. Okay. And they're talking about each, everybody. Okay, so I will let you read this. This is one thing, you know, you want to get your brain around AES. And once you understand one, you understand the rest. Like I said, we are not cryptographers, we're not crypto analysts. We just want to know how good is it. And AES is very popular because it's very good. And the last one. And we talked about the H algorithm. We said this is not really encryption. This is not hashing. This is an algorithm that is purely used to securely exchange. I'm getting tired of saying that sentence. This is an algorithm that is purely used to safely, securely exchange a pre-shared key over the insecure public internet. And we will see it next week when we cover IPsec. Okay, and there are many different flavors of DH, everybody, and one flavor is, you know, those two parties don't have to exchange anything, and they can calculate the pre-shared key using prime mathematical formulas, all of which goes way over my head. So if you have a PhD in math, you will probably be able to follow this. But they give us a very simple analogy with colors. PKI, public key infrastructure. And if you don't feel that you know enough about it, please make a note. And please spend an hour or 2 reading about it. There's no escaping it. There is no escaping it. So just get it out of the way and become more comfortable with PKI. And then you can Google PKI and go from there. Okay. Asymmetric key algorithms. Okay, so remember SSL has been deprecated. Okay, we have SSH. We're all familiar with SSH. This is the secure telnet that uses SSL or TLS. A pretty good privacy is the granddaddy of all public key infrastructure algorithms, and this is really a good place to start. So if you want to Google pretty good privacy and start from there, great. Internet Key Exchange, IKE, we'll actually see IKE next week. So when we talk about IPsec, you know, we can use and we will use IKE to exchange those symmetric keys securely between the 2 parties. So we'll come back to IKE next week. SSL is the very first algorithm from here, everybody. And TLS is the new king. Long live the new king. And this is just an application. This is secure telnet. We've talked about this, everybody, private, public key. So you see the names Alice and Bob a lot. Whoever came up with those two names, they're super popular right now when we talk about PKI, because everybody uses Alice and Bob. And if they want to communicate securely, Alice will use Bob's public key, and Bob will use Alice's public key to encrypt. And then if they want to sign, Bob will sign with his private key and Alice will sign with her private key. And usually we hash the message and we sign the hashed value with the private key. And this is what SMIME does. Okay. Digital signature properties. Signature is authentic. Signature is unalterable. Signature is not reusable. And this is the non-repudiation part. Okay, you can actually go to court these days, say, but it was signed. Zico cannot say, he didn't send this email. It was signed by Zico. And the court would say, yep, it was signed by Zico, therefore it is Zico. So this is as good as signing it by hand. We talked about digital certificates as it come from a certificate authority. And holy cow, lots of slides in this chapter. But it's a great chapter. I love this chapter, and it's a great preparation for chapter 8 and 9. And this is where they issue you a private and a public key. The one thing I want to say about private and public keys, they're not all the same. So they're not all the same. For example, if you want to use a digital certificate for email, okay, you don't really have to go through many hoops to do that. And if you have an e-commerce sign and you want to use a digital certificate for that, so you can exchange that symmetric key I've been talking about, then they want to know more about you. And that's a different kind of a digital certificate. Make sense, everybody? So there are different classifications of digital certificates based on what you want to use the digital certificate for. From all you have to do is just send an email from riskz@lynbenton.edu and say, yep, if that's all you want to use your digital certificate for, it's going to cost you so much. Here it is. 2, I'm starting an e-commerce website and I need a digital certificate for that. And that's a different process and a different payment. So we talked about RSA and DSA, everybody. RSA is by far the much more popular one. Ron, Adi, and Edelman, Rivett, Shamir, and Edelman, RSA. That's where the name came from. It's been around for a long time. Clearly, this is old because now we're up to 4096. So this slide over here is old, and it's super popular, crazy popular. Okay, and DSA, it's only good for signature, and I'm not sure I've ever seen anything signed by DSA because you can sign it with RSA. So why would anyone want to get an RSA and a DSA when RSA can do everything DSA does and much more? Good, everybody? So just get yourself an RSA and you can still digitally sign. So as far as I can remember, just off the top of my head, I have never seen anything signed with DSA. This is how popular DSA is. PKI, this is what you need to educate yourself on. Okay, so Net Academy gives you a good introduction. Chapter 8, it's just a good introduction. It's not enough. So please Google and read and educate yourself. And you only need to do this once and then you're good. So we need a certificate authority. This is, if you need a passport, you have to go to a passport office. That's the passport office. You need a driver's license, you go to DMV. You need a certificate, you go to a certificate authority. And there's a bunch of them. VeriSign is very, very big. Symantec is very big. So there's a bunch of different certificate authorities out there. Those are the institutions that are authorized to issue a digital certificate. And you have to go through them. You can always generate your own. If you remember in many examples, especially when we were using SSH with the router, we generated our own. And for your own purposes, good enough. You don't have to pay money. And your PC can also generate. I can generate one right now on my PC. And for your private, personal purposes, it's good enough. Just nobody can authenticate that certificate authority. Okay, it's like you just created it yourself in your home PC. No one's gonna honor it. It's like making your own driver's license, making your own passport. Okay, so yes, you can, and you can use it in private farm. Just don't get on Highway 5 with your homemade driver's license. These are the classes I was talking about before. Okay. Yep. This is SMIME, everybody. This is secure email. We talked about SSL and TLS. This is IPsec, the focus for next chapter, chapter 8. And EAP is for encrypting the payload, and TLS, we've covered TLS before. And EAP is something we use. This is my reminder, everybody. This is what we use to encrypt the payload of an IPsec packet, and we will be coming back to EAP next week. This is the stuff you need: certificate authorities, registration authority. So you take the load of the certificate authority. So you want a digital certificate, you go to an RA that goes to a CA. And this is what your browser does every day. Every time you go somewhere and you're using their certificate, you need to verify. And this is why over here, it said certificate valid and trusted. So I had to go and verify that. Is this driver's license valid? Is this passport valid? Back to Alice and Bob. Questions? Chapter 7. So in the 2 minutes we have left, what would you like to do on Thursday? We can take a day off. We can come back and do a review, and maybe you will have more questions, and I will be happy to try and answer your questions on Thursday. We can start chapter 8, but we don't need to because we're doing fine. We're doing great. A timeline point of view. So what would you like to do on Thursday? Review?
Yeah, probably, unless everyone just wants to. I'm good with a review because reviews are always good.
And questions. I mean, it may only be an hour long.
Yeah, because after I do the labs for tomorrow, I'll probably have more questions about that.
Okay. So is everyone cool with that?
Yeah,
so
I'm good for review. It's
okay,
it's
good. Then let's do that on Thursday. So we have a class on Thursday. We will do a review. Please come with some questions. Please, bare minimum, look at the Net Academy material. Bare minimum, look at the Net Academy material. And I'm going to show you this and run out of here, everybody. We need this knowledge for next week. The more sense chapter 7 makes, the easier IPsec is going to be. And if it doesn't make sense, I'm not scaring you, but I'm telling you, IPsec is going to confuse the heck out of you. So let's master chapter 7 before we dive into chapter 8 and 9. I do have to run. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you on Thursday.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.